I'm Kevin Vance. I'm the director of the Center for Constitutional Liberty. Thanks very much for coming tonight. I'm really excited about our speaker tonight. He was my undergraduate teacher, and great scholar, and I think everyone's going to learn a lot from him tonight. I'm going to introduce one of our constitutional fellows who will give a full introduction. Cecilia Helmuth is a sophomore from the St. Louis area, and she's a politics and major and music minor, and she's a constitutional fellow. So, Cece.
Charles Kesler is a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute, editor of the Claremont Review of Books, host of Claremont's The American Mind video series, and the Dengler-Dykema Distinguished Professor of Government at Claremont-McKenna College. Dr. Kesler also teaches in the Claremont Institute's Publius Fellows Program and Lincoln Fellows Program. He received his BA in Social Studies and his MA and Ph.D. in Government from Harvard University. From 1989 to 2008, Dr. Kesler was director of Claremont-McKenna College's Henry Salvatori Center for the Study of Individual Freedom in the Modern World. He is the recipient of prestigious 2018 Bradley Prize, a high honor bestowed upon distinguished individuals who have influenced American scholarship and debate. From September 2000 to March 2001, he served as vice chairman of the advisory committee to the U.S. Congress's James Madison Commemoration Commission. He was elected in June 2000 as a member of the Scholars Commission on the Jefferson-Hemings issue, sponsored by the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society. Dr. Kesler is the author of I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism, the editor of Saving the Revolution, the Federalist Papers in the American Founding, co-editor with John B. Kinker of Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, 10 Years of the Claremont Review of Books, and co-editor with William F. Buckley, Jr. of Keeping the Tablets, Modern American Conservative Thought. He has written extensively on American constitutionalism and political thought, and his edition of the Federalist Papers is the best-selling edition in the country.
Thank you very much for that charming introduction. I should indicate that even though I am the editor of an edition of the Federalist Papers, I did not write the Federalist Papers. I knew the authors of the Federalist Papers, and I'm not one of them. It's very wonderful to be here. It's my first time at Benedictine College, but not my first time in Kansas. My first time in Kansas was a long time ago, 1976, when as a cub reporter for the largest West Virginia newspaper, that's where I'm from originally, the Charleston Daily Mail, I reported on the Republican National Convention in 1976 that took place in Kansas City, downtown Kansas City. And it was the last nominating convention that really mattered, in the sense that no one knew who the nominee was going to be going into the convention. It was a decision of the convention. This was the famous one in which Gerald Ford was the incumbent president, placed there by Richard Nixon at the end of Watergate. And Ronald Reagan was challenging him from the floor of the convention and came this close to winning, came this close to defeating the incumbent Republican nominee for president. So it was an exciting time to be a young reporter and to see what real political deliberation was like, what it was like to hear arguments and to hear, of course, appeals to interest, and to be swayed, to see a convention swayed by those appeals. You don't see that very much. Now the conventions are mostly ceremonial and advertising, essentially publicity generating events. It's also a great honor to be here tonight because I'm in the presence of my friend and former student, Kevin Vance, and who is doing wonderful things here with the program in taking liberties with the Constitution, or something like that, isn't that? I may have gotten that name wrong, but it's something very noble sounding, I think. Anyway, congratulations on that, and thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here. So what I want to talk about this evening is the 2024 election. You may remember it, and the future of American politics. So let me start just a little bit before the 2024 election. When Donald Trump first took office in 2017, the country was in the midst of almost a decade of progressive assertiveness and dominance, dating from Barack Obama's election in 2008 and re-election in 2012. Hillary Clinton, Obama's designated successor, if not quite heir apparent, you may remember that he deliberately skipped over Joe Biden in order to arrange for Hillary Clinton to win the nomination and be his successor. Mrs. Clinton joined Obama in preferring the sobriquet progressive to liberal, and she was supposed to win and extend the Obama administration and this period of progressive transformation of American politics from 8 to 16 years, at best at least. But she didn't win. Trump's first election victory in 2016 was a kind of preliminary sign that the script, the progressive script, might be changing. But the political and cultural resistance he met in the next 4 years, the Russia hoax, George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, 2 impeachments, and eventually numerous state and federal prosecutions, showed that the old regime was not going quietly or gracefully. Biden's defeat of Trump in 2020 was in a way the formal culmination of this resistance movement that had lasted all through Trump's initial presidency. Biden's victory also represented in some ways the last gasp of the Obama administration and of the progressive evolution of the Democratic Party that had shaped really 20th century, all of 20th century American politics. If you could have sliced Joe Biden in two, like some ancient tree trunk, you would have seen the political rings recording a century of political hope and change in America ever since FDR's New Deal in the 1930s. Indeed, Roosevelt was Joe Biden's beau ideal of a progressive Democratic president, to whom Biden returned again and again for inspiration and encouragement. You may remember that he began his final State of the Union address, or his final annual message to Congress, by invoking the memory of FDR. This was the shouted annual message that you may remember, that Biden essentially shouted from beginning to end to prove his virility, you know, and that he still had it, which he didn't. But anyway, this audience is probably too young to remember that in 2008, Time magazine put Barack Obama on its cover, dressed as a new FDR, with a pince-nez, you know, eyeglasses and cigarette holder and cigarette, and the caption on the cover of Time magazine was "The New Deal." And that's how Time thought about him, and I think that's basically how Joe Biden thought about Obama too, that this was a chance to renew the great rhythm of Democratic Party-led reform in American politics, to have a new New Deal or a new Great Society under the charismatic leadership of Barack Obama. But for Biden, Barack Obama was always, you might say, second to FDR. And that's not the way Obama saw himself, but that is the way that his vice president, I think, tended to think of him. At any rate, Biden's slogan for the progressive ideal he was pursuing as vice president and then as president was, you may know, our democracy. This became a kind of term of art with the Biden administration, a term that he used again and again in his speeches, our democracy, which was meant to convey quietly much more than simply, our democracy, our contemporary democracy. It was meant to convey an impatience with yesterday's democracy, with the backwards-facing and outdated democratic formulas and distinctions of the past, with what FDR memorably called horse and buggy constitutionalism. Horse and buggy constitutionalism meant 18th century constitutionalism, which had to be transcended by 20th century, or nowadays 21st century constitutionalism. And thus the slogan, or the term of art, our democracy, implies and conceals a growing hostility to the original 1787 Constitution and its amendments, what I would call the Founders' Constitution. Having long criticized the Electoral College, the filibuster, and the role of plutocratic interests in our politics, American progressives are nowadays preparing for a new phase of open, bold critique of the Supreme Court, the Senate, and even the system of representation in the House. Biden himself is not necessarily privy to the progressive agenda, the coming progressive agenda, but he could not and would never have opposed it because he is too, he's of one mind with its premises, even if he can't see the conclusions from those premises. And so he doesn't have much in the way of ground to dissent from those conclusions. Our democracy, therefore, means essentially woke democracy, in the sense of being the first democracy to face up to the fundamental injustice of the American constitutional order, the first to acknowledge and try to overcome the country's undemocratic origins, especially its systemic racism. This is a term that Biden used quite a bit on the campaign trail in the 2020 election cycle and didn't stop using as president. You'll also find it in some of his major speeches from the Oval Office and from Philadelphia and other places. The old democracy, or the original American democracy, was, in this view, built on racism all the way down. Not merely built on what used to be called race prejudice. This is sort of a term from the 1950s and the 1960s. Race prejudice meant exactly that people had a kind of prejudgment in favor of their own race and against other races, but it was a prejudgment, that is, one that could be affected, one that could be improved, one that could be changed and argued with. The new emphasis is not upon racism as a prejudice, but upon racism as an ism, as a philosophy, as a conviction, as a system of beliefs which allegedly, at least, infected America from its very origins to the present day. The growing audacity of the left's distrust of the old Constitution is striking, I think, in today's America, but not unprecedented. Its roots go back a century to the birth of modern liberalism in the progressive era. One of the subjects of a few of my books and of my scholarship, about which I will say something briefly right now. If you look at the rise of liberalism, or of progressivism, if you want to use that synonym, in American politics, you'll see that it wasn't a sudden revolution. It was a rolling revolution that took place really over the course of almost a century. One wave followed by another wave. The first wave was progressivism at the very beginning of the 20th century. And it was successful enough to generate eventually a second wave, which was successful enough to generate eventually a third wave, which I'll explain very briefly. In each case, the revolution began in the universities, spread to the Democratic Party, which then tried to remake the country in the image of the new ideas that had come from the university. So I would call these three waves of liberalism: first, the politics of progress; second, the politics of entitlement; and third, to use a term that Hillary Clinton borrowed from a social scientist, the politics of meaning. And let me just say something briefly about them to set the scene for talking about 2024. The politics of progress gave birth to the idea of the living Constitution. This is a term that Woodrow Wilson used and that his political followers adopted and propagated, and we still hear it today in confirmation battles for U.S. Supreme Court justices and even federal judges. The living Constitution usually versus the original Constitution is the language that you hear of it now. But in the beginning, the living Constitution was meant to be a philosophy of the whole government, not just the judiciary, but also the executive and the legislative branch. And there are sort of three things that are peculiar to the theory of the living Constitution that started 100 years ago. One is that it turns the Constitution from a document of individual rights towards becoming a doctrine of and a document of group rights. And second, that it changes the Constitution from being something more or less fixed in meaning to something that is very consciously evolutionary in meaning, something that has to change with the times and adapt to the times. And third, that it is a change from a more limited Constitution, limited by sort of fixed or unchanging ideas of rights, individual rights, and right and wrong, towards being a document of more or less unlimited government, not bound down by any set of principles or set of doctrines, but open to evolution, to change, to progress. And you know, one thing you can say is that the American progressives from the very beginning really have believed in progress. I mean, sometimes terms of political art tell you something truthful about politics. And in this case, progressives believe in progress, not as an accidental outcome, but as something baked into the system from the very beginning. That there's a kind of inevitability, a kind of cosmic support for progress, for the future being better than the present, and the present being better than the past. And that's not accidental. It's not just the way things happen sometimes to work. It's the way things are meant to work. And that there's a kind of current in human events that will necessarily take us in that direction. The inevitability of progress, you might call it. So this notion that the old written Constitution, the limited Constitution, the fixed Constitution, had to be supplanted by a new Constitution, was Wilson's contribution, you might say, one of his enduring contributions to American politics. When Barack Obama speaks, or when he spoke about the difference between being on the wrong side of history versus being on the right side of history, he is appealing essentially to this notion of progress. On the right side of history lies progressive reform, improvement, greater liberty, greater equality, greater justice, and maybe even greater prosperity. On the wrong side of history lies injustice, falling backwards, not forwards in time, and a kind of a decay, eventually, of limited government out of any kind, really, of constitutional government. So one thing that one can say about the original notion of the living Constitution is that it changes the relation between the Constitution and government. The original Constitution was meant to be a law, a kind of higher law above government. It was meant to set the purposes of government and to set limits to government. And this is the common way we speak of, constitutional law. We expect the policies of government to be made to conform to the Constitution. If they don't, they're unconstitutional and can be struck down by the court or repealed by the legislature and the executive. But the living Constitution changes that priority. Instead of the Constitution being above the normal statute law and the normal laws of politics, the opposite is true. The purpose of the living Constitution is to adjust to policy's needs, to adjust to what this generation thinks it needs vitally, whether it's Social Security or whether it's gay marriage or whatever sort of reform or change is thought necessary. That has to be constitutional in some way, because the Constitution's purpose is to allow us to govern ourselves in accordance with the times. In order to adjust to the times, the Constitution has to be made flexible and manipulable by politics. So that's how you get from limited government to a much less limited or unlimited form of government. The second wave of liberalism hit in the 1930s and took the form of the so-called New Deal of FDR, Joe Biden's favorite. The emblematic expression of this is what FDR called the Second Bill of Rights. The Second Bill of Rights is something he announced only in 1944, towards the end of his administration and towards the end of his life. But the idea of it informed the whole spirit of the New Deal from the very beginning. This is where entitlements come from. The Second Bill of Rights contains things like the right to health care, the right to a job, the right to a vacation from the job, the right to a good education, the right to a decent home, various kinds of socioeconomic goods or benefits that can be supplied as a last resort, at least, by government. And so these new kinds of rights, the welfare rights that are in the Second Bill of Rights, require government programs to be realized. These are expensive rights. In order to have a right to health care, the government has to be able to pay doctors, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies. It has to take charge of the healthcare system, at least insofar as ensuring the delivery of the goods of health and healthcare to most of the population. So these rights are what political scientists sometimes call programmatic rights. They don't exist without programs. They require something like Social Security, something like Obamacare, like Medicare, Medicaid, very expensive programs entitling people to benefits which they can't fully pay for themselves. That was the second wave of liberalism. The third wave really hits the politics of meaning. This really comes in the 1960s. And it brings with it, in effect, a third Bill of Rights, although no one exactly named it that. But the third Bill of Rights is to another different set, not welfare rights, but what we might now call identity rights. That is, the whole complex of rights which is now so important to our politics, that you're entitled to your own lifestyle, to your own culture, to your own morality, to your own identity. And that other people have a kind of obligation to respect and to acknowledge your identity, your morality, your lifestyle. In its original 1960s sense, the two most important grounds of these new rights are both facts about the body, the human body, namely race and sex. And so all of these rights, or almost all of them, circle back to those considerations. You have a right to kind of racial integrity, racial exaltation even, and also a kind of right to sexual satisfaction, to sexual liberty and approval in the pursuit of sexual satisfaction. This right to recognition by others in order to give you a grounded sense of the rightness or affirmation of these new kinds of rights, gives rise to other categories of goods and bad things, like, for example, hate speech. Hate speech is a new concept which implies that, if you don't approve of transgenderism or of homosexual marriage or various other things, that is improper. That is a form of hate. It's a form of incivility at the least, and worse than that, it's a form of intolerance and a form of sort of contempt of your fellow human being that can't pass muster. So, for example, today in the category of race, it's not enough to be silent about racism or to claim to not be a racist. You have to actively be anti-racist all the time. You have to be positively in favor of hate speech against hate speech. And if you're not engaged in the generation of that, you are as bad as if you were speaking up for racism or for one of these categorically evil things. So that, in a nutshell, is, I apologize for covering so much ground so quickly, but in a way, you have to see how the 20th century, the evolution of these ideas, these new waves of liberalism, have changed American politics over the course of the 20th century. Our politics didn't used to be about the right to health care or the right to Social Security. It didn't used to be about the right to homosexual life, homosexual lifestyle, or even to homosexual marriage or to transgenderism. But now our politics is about these things. Our politics used to be about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, and property, mostly. And that was regarded as a very large moral catalog to deal with in those days. It meant it committed you, as it were, to being anti-slavery and to being in favor of many kinds of social equality beyond merely the legal equality of citizenship or voting rights. But that is now regarded as a very primitive moral agenda from the point of view of today's progressivism, today's liberalism. It's not that they've completely turned their backs on the first wave or the second wave of liberalism, but from the third wave's point of view, these are trite things. These are ordinary things. They're not the cutting edge of liberalism. They're not where the action is. They're not where your sympathies ought to be engaged and your passions aroused. It's where the new agenda is emerging. That's where you should be and where the action is. So if the 20th century was the liberal century, the century when liberalism in this sense emerged, scaled the heights of American politics, and established itself as a central part of that politics. My point tonight is that there are tantalizing and accumulating signs that the 21st century will have a very different political character from the 20th century and its liberal agenda, starting with the 2024 election. Unlike in 2016 or even 2000 with the George Bush election, no one today is contesting the legitimacy of the 2024 election results. This is the first election in a while that has been more or less accepted by both parties as, if not flawless, at least as fair enough to be regarded as binding. In fact, Donald Trump enters office with the cultural and political winds behind him, filling his sails for a change. Trump today is almost cool. College and professional athletes are emulating his impromptu YMCA dance, which he breaks into, as you know, in many of his rallies. The tech billionaires who only recently shunned him now line up behind him, literally, as at his inauguration. They're all sort of seated there, you know, and they're not scowling. They're not casting shadow or shade upon him. They are more or less basking in the ceremony and in his elevation. So something already is very different about the tone of the 2024 election and the politics emerging, taking us into it and out of it, at least for the present. Donald Trump and the Republican Party had a triumphant election day, gaining ground in all parts of the country and almost in every voting sector. Trump won all 7 of the ballyhooed swing states by comfortable margins, except maybe in the 3 blue wall states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which he won, however, but by smaller margins than in the other swing states. But nonetheless, even these tough ones, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, he won all 3 of them in 2024, as he had in 2016. He is the first Republican to win them twice since Ronald Reagan. Trump regains office, of course, alongside a Republican Senate and a Republican-controlled House of Representatives. The trifecta which political scientists call undivided government, and not enjoyed by Republicans since the first 2 years of his own first term. President Ronald Reagan, by contrast, never enjoyed the luxury of having both legislative houses under friendly partisan control at the same time. Part of what made Reagan's victory in 1980 such a breakthrough was the unexpected 12 GOP senators who rode in on his coattails. They restored Republican control of the Senate for the first time in a generation, since 1954. It's true they lost it again only 6 years later in the election of 1986. Nonetheless, the party never controlled the House of Representatives under Reagan, but had enough, there were still enough conservative Democrats in those days for the GOP to exert a kind of operational majority within the House. Nevertheless, the age of Reagan, as Steve Hayward titled his epic 2-volume Life and Times of the Gipper, proceeded more or less smoothly despite facing divided government every day of its life in Washington, D.C. This had something to do with the dimensions of Reagan's victory in 1980. He won the popular vote with 50.7%, which sounds wan until you consider he had to battle not only Jimmy Carter, but also a strong third-party candidate in John Anderson, who got 6.6% of the popular vote. Without any strong third parties in 2024, Donald Trump won the popular vote by a slightly lower percentage, 49.8%, maybe 49.9%, depending on how you round it, but just shy of a majority. Reagan's victory in the Electoral College, however, in 1980 was highly impressive, 489 electoral votes, compared to Jimmy Carter's 49. 489 versus 49. Reagan won every state but 5. By contrast, Trump this year or last year earned 312 electoral votes from 31 states. Trump's margin, although certainly laudable, falls about in the middle of the pack historically, lower than Barack Obama's, for example, who won 365 in 2008 and slightly fewer, 332 in 2012. By the numbers alone, therefore, it is difficult to tell if America stands on the threshold of a new political age or not. Is the age of Trump about to dawn, or are we misleading ourselves to think along those lines? The numbers alone are not, in my mind at least, persuasive that this is a new political age whose dawn we hail. Not everyone agrees with me. Patrick Ruffini, the talented Republican pollster and political analyst, for example, pronounces boldly, quote, "The realignment is here," unquote. On his blog, he points to evidence such as this: the first GOP popular vote win in 20 years, though, as I said, just shy of a majority. The big shifts in the educational and class makeup of the parties, and the Republicans' capture for the first time of both low education and low income voters, which he calls a thoroughgoing working class realignment. I think actually the more careful way to make his point, the way he makes it in his book of 2023, is that we may be starting a national realignment, but we still have a considerable way to go before we can confirm it and add it to the history books. It will take at least 2 or 3 more electoral cycles to establish, for example, that the Republicans will be able to retain and expand their now quite narrow control of the House and Senate. It's always tempting for politicians and analysts to define realignment downward, to make it seem like it's within our grasp, that it's right here. But I don't think that's fair or accurate. And at least right now, we're not in a position to say that the GOP looks like a new majority party in the country, the kind of majority party that the Democrats had before the Civil War, that the Republicans had after the Civil War, and that the Democrats held again during the Great Depression and for a generation after that. If that's our standard, I don't think we have a realignment yet. But something does feel different, nonetheless, about 2024. For one thing, this is Trump's third election in a row as the presidential nominee of his party. It's highly unusual for a major American political party to trust its nomination to the same candidate more than twice. In recent decades, Richard Nixon is the only other example of a three-time nominee. He ran in 1960 and lost. He ran again in 68 and won, and narrowly, and in 1972, his third race, he won overwhelmingly in a blowout against George McGovern. But those three races were not successive like Trump's. Trump, 2016, 2020, 2024. That is very, very unusual. And the result of that, at a minimum, is that Trump is enormously influential within the Republican Party, having commanded it in battle three times, even though he only won twice. Still, he has left his impression on the party very deeply. In 2016, Trump won narrowly. About 80,000 votes across 3 states made the difference. In 2020, Trump lost narrowly, about 40,000 votes, also in 3 states, separated him from Joe Biden. But this time around, he won more or less commandingly. Not by a huge majority, but still by a significant one. About 2.3 million votes separated him from Biden. Not, which is not an insignificant amount. His first 2 elections posed the question, which was the anomaly? Was it anomalous for Trump to win in 2016, or was something anomalous about him losing in 2020? Now we have more evidence. He's won 2 out of 3. He won 2016 very narrowly. He won 2020 fairly easily. And so he's going to look differently in history than he would have had he not run again in 2024. He, of course, now is paired with Grover Cleveland in being the only president to lose and run again and win again, to have 2 non-consecutive terms. Trump is very proud of that for some reason. He's the 45th and the 47th president, as he likes to make the point. And at least one can say this: having this delayed second term gives him the chance to put the infamy of the January 6th riots in the rearview mirror. And it's not anymore inevitable that people will look to January 6th as the culminating and telltale event of Trump's political life. He now has another 4 years as president. If he has a successful 4 years, he will look in history very differently than he would otherwise if he'd let the riot of 2021 be his swan song for his entire political life. Now, to his enemies' consternation, Trump has made himself the dominant political figure of the age. not only in the United States, but even indirectly in Europe and elsewhere. He has not accomplished this by persuading his critics with his eloquent words and deeds. He is not a classic statesman by any means, but he has done so by dominating the imagination of friend and foe alike. They can't get him out of their heads, which is the way he likes it. Trump monitors the zeitgeist with all of its contradictions and tensions. His task, so far at least, has been to inflame and illuminate these tensions, not to resolve them, to expose what he regards as the growing illegitimacy of American political establishments, Democratic as well as Republican, rather than to found new establishments to take their place. But the significance of 2024 may well be that, like the contractor and real estate mogul he once was, Trump has cleared the ground as well as he can and is about to begin the construction phase of his legacy. So then if we look at 2024 as the beginning of a new phase in Trump's political activity and his ambition, what do we see? That I'd say the 2024 race was a combination of various political exposés of his opponents and glimpses of a new majority party that could be a borning. Take the debate with his then opponent, Joe Biden. The effect of that infamous debate was to expose the emperor as he did have clothes on, but he was non-compos mentis, not because of anything Trump said, although Trump had some good lines, but by Biden's own sad difficulties, what the neurologists call the flight of reason, or sorry, the flight of ideas. They actually use both terms, but then a month after that debate came the first assassination attempt. The first. There was more than one. And his gutsy, fist-pumping rise from the podium floor in Butler, Pennsylvania. The contrast between the two men, between the rising sun and the setting sun, was unforgettable. Though it took him and his party a while to admit it, Biden was already an ex-president at that point. The most delicious moments of the campaign came near the end, when Trump appeared working at a McDonald's franchise, and a few days later wearing a high-visibility emergency vest and climbing into the cab of a garbage truck. Biden had, the backdrop to that, of course, was that Biden had dismissed Trump supporters as garbage a day before. Biden pleaded that he didn't mean it that way, and I tend to believe him. Although I believe him because nothing he says anymore is fully conscious. So, who knows? His critics, Trump's critics, dismiss these episodes, the McDonald's and the garbage truck, as stunts, which they were. But the most memorable, amusing, and politically revealing stunts since Calvin Coolidge was photographed wearing an American Indian headdress. Look it up. It's on, it's on the web somewhere. Calvin Coolidge was wearing this full Indian headdress because it was given him by an Indian tribe as a gift for signing a law granting citizenship to American Indians. So there was a reason he was wearing it, and that he took pride in it. Native Americans, by the way, another voting bloc that Trump won in 2024. If Kamala Harris had showed up at a McDonald's, despite or precisely because she had claimed to have worked at one as a young woman, though which one she could not say, the stunt would have, in my judgment at least, flopped and been mocked from coast to coast as surely as Michael Dukakis's notorious ride in a tank in 1988. A well-known consumer of McDonald's fast food, who even served it in the White House, Trump looked right at home working the French fryer and the drive-through window. Very important to make this stunt work. Perhaps the most striking graphic of the election was CNN's map of the United States, showing a county-by-county breakdown of the presidential vote tally. Each county was indicated by a small red or blue mountain, or Christmas tree, if you were thinking seasonally, and don't mind the wrong colors, the size of the mountain varying by the percentage change in the vote for the winning party in that county since 2020 to 2024. It displayed at a glance the dynamic political topography of the country. New unexpected peaks appeared, colored red, and whole mountain ranges upthrust by the tectonic electoral forces at work. CNN reported that of the almost 3,250 counties in America, 2,650 shifted towards the Republicans, and only some 279 turned more Democratic. That is, almost 10 times as many counties voted more Republican than voted more Democratic. A red shift you didn't need a telescope or a spectrometer to notice. In astronomy, a red shift generally indicates the object is moving farther away from the observer. In politics, in 2024, it meant the voters were moving farther away from the Democrats. Virtually the whole country shifted to the red. Even the blue states shifted further red. More voters in California voted for Trump this time than in the past. More voters in New York voted for Trump this time than in the past. They helped to provide his winning margin in the popular vote total. He couldn't have done it really without support from the blue states as well as from the red states. Trump turned Long Island red, winning both Nassau and Suffolk counties. Florida, once a swing state, became a reliable Republican state guarded by sort of two red mountain ranges along its Atlantic and Gulf coasts. Trump even took Miami-Dade County, very Hispanic county, handily. The maps cannot tell us, though, why the red shift was so widespread in so many counties, in so many states, all across the country. Were Americans repelled by the Democrats and their programs, or were they attracted by the Republicans and their promises? We know from county and state registration data that the Republicans had been gaining ground in the intervening 4 years since 2020. In Pennsylvania, for example, the Democratic registration edge from 2020 to 2024 went from 686,000 in the Dems' favor to 286,000, a change of 400,000 registrations. In Arizona, the GOP's edge increased from 94,000 to 294,000. For whatever reason, in other words, history was being made even before the election. The country was moving rightward. The country was moving in a red direction. Partly because of Trump, but I think part of it was also independent from Trump, because it wasn't clear from 2020 to 2024. Only in 2022 did Trump announce that he was going to run again. So this was, you can't sign all of this off to Trump's effect. And polls indicated, finally, that a greater share of the electorate identified as Republican than as Democrats in 2024 for the first time since the New Deal. Almost a century, the Democrats had been mostly dominant in self-identifications in these kinds of polls, and suddenly they were not. The Democrats' effort to build a broader coalition of resistance to Donald Trump, in other words, broader than they had assembled in 2016 or even 2020, failed spectacularly. They lost ground almost everywhere. Kamala Harris, as their candidate eventually, faced a dilemma. She could not run as the designated successor to Joe Biden's deeply unpopular administration, but she could not afford to repudiate it either. And so the term Biden-Harris administration dropped from sight, except as a Republican talking point. Kamala declared her independence from Biden quietly and indirectly by stressing different issues and, above all, a different mood to her campaign. In so doing, she also, in effect, declared independence from her own rhetoric and campaign pitches in 2020 when she was running as his fresh-faced vice presidential candidate. The change went largely unnoticed because who remembers what a vice presidential candidate says anyway? But let me just compare Harris in 2020 to Harris in 2024. In 2020, when she accepted her party's vice presidential nomination, in those COVID days, she couldn't do this with other people present. So she spoke at an empty Chase Center in Wilmington, Delaware, not at the convention itself, but there. And when she spoke in 2020, she noted the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave the vote to women. She hailed in particular the black women who helped secure that victory, and yet long after its ratification had still been prohibited from voting by Jim Crow. She connected these injustices to the COVID pandemic and its differential effects. While, quote, "This virus touches us all," she said, "let's be honest, it is not an equal opportunity offender. Black, Latino, and indigenous people are suffering and dying disproportionately. This is not a coincidence." I'm still quoting her. "This is not a coincidence," she argued. "It is the effect of structural racism, of inequities in education and technology, healthcare and housing, job security and transportation. The injustice in reproductive and maternal health care figures here too. In the excessive use of force by police, I'm not sure, and in our broader criminal justice system." As the vice presidential candidate, in short, in 2020, she was in full progressive mode, echoing her running mate's frequent campaign speeches condemning systemic racism as the deepest cause of America's ills. Harris brought up George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, too. America was very far from being that beloved community, she called it, of justice and kindness that our parents and grandparents fought for. Okay, fast forward 4 years to Harris's speech for the Democrats at the convention in Chicago. Accepting her party's presidential nomination, gone was the emphasis on women and black women as the key to American history and identity. She presented herself not as the descendant of an enslaved race, but as the proud daughter of two immigrants, one black, although Caribbean, and one South Asian. And as a proud citizen of, quote, "the greatest democracy in the history of the world, and indeed the greatest nation on earth." Harris pledged, quote, to fight for this country we love and to uphold the awesome responsibility that comes with the greatest privilege on earth, the privilege and pride of being an American, unquote. In place of 2020's complexities and imperfections of the American promise and the enduring reality of structural racism throughout American history, Harris promised in 2024 to honor and, quote, to hold sacred America's fundamental principles, unquote, which apparently were not so bad after all. Although not strictly contradictory, the two speeches differed profoundly in tone and in her evaluation of America. She abandoned all the woke or progressive critiques that she had featured in 2020 for a more centrist, middle-class, openly patriotic appeal. She shifted red, in effect. That's the unacknowledged source of her politics of joy, which dominated the initial months of her run for the presidency. Even when it came to abortion, the one feminist issue that she emphasized throughout the 2024 campaign, she spoke of it less as a question of the empowerment of women or the autonomy of women, and more as a violation of reproductive freedom or reproductive rights, as though it were a case of big government intruding on a libertarian right of property that she was opposing. Kamala Harris's red shift served an obvious purpose. She wanted to win. She and her advisors sensed rightly that woke orthodoxy, or even Biden's version of it, warning that Trump imperiled our democracy, was not a winning strategy. It was this new moderate Kamala Harris she displayed in her presidential debate with Trump, whom she made fun of as weird and unserious rather than as demonic or dictatorial. This was also cool Kamala, brat Kamala, confident about America and excited to be ushering in its happy green future. It sounded like a good strategy, but it didn't work. One reason it didn't was that though the public didn't recall or care what she had said in her 2020 acceptance speech, they did remember and were reminded by Trump and even by the media of her endorsement of various other progressive policies, like Bernie Sanders, one-up to Obamacare, his more socialist emendation of Obamacare, the right to government-paid sex change operations for prison inmates and even illegal immigrants in prison, something that she said before a camera so that the Republicans were able to replay it again and again in their ads. She was in favor, of course, of a ban on fracking, not popular in Pennsylvania and in other states that have oil that they'd like to recover. And so what to say about all of these positions she had taken, which were very progressive but not very popular in 2024. Her answer was essentially that there were too many of them to deny or even to disguise, so it's better to say as little about them as possible. And so the usually voluble Harris adopted a strategy of obmutescence. She would say merely that these old positions were no longer valid. She had changed her positions, but she refused to say why. This was not a strategy that could survive press attention for very long. It was as though the only thing she remembered from her days as a prosecuting attorney was that defendants have a right to remain silent and that anything you say can and will be used against you. So she said almost nothing. And so I'm coming to an end here. Several days after the election, hold on just one second. So the message she settled on at the end of her campaign was one that Biden had pioneered at the beginning of his campaign when he was still the presidential nominee of his party. And that was the argument that had very little to do with joy or with compromise. It was the argument that Trump is Hitler or Trump is a fascist. And yet, several days after the election, there were Joe Biden and Donald Trump sitting together in the Oval Office, smiling and shaking hands. Biden addressed Trump as former president, president-elect, and Donald. He looked forward to a, quote, smooth transition, and he offered to do everything we can to make sure you're accommodated. Afterwards, the two men, joined by staffers, chatted for 2 hours in private. Now, this raised the question, if Donald Trump is Hitler, would you shake hands with Herr Hitler? Would you promise to do everything possible to accommodate him in his new job? What was Biden thinking? Always assuming that he was thinking. From a certain point of view, the smooth transition is a hallowed American tradition, a tribute to the continuity of constitutional democracy in spite of our frequent and sometimes bitter partisan disagreements. That tribute depends, however, on the presumption that both parties, in honoring constitutional democracy, are honoring the same thing, and not two very different ideas of the same thing. Thomas Jefferson captured the presumption brilliantly in his first inaugural in 1801, coming after a particularly divisive 10 years of political conflict. He said, quote, "But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." Those were the two contending parties in 1800. Are Americans in 2024 still brethren of the same principle? As Jefferson implies, though not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle, some differences of opinion are. This was the same Joe Biden, shaking hands with Donald Trump, after all, who had denounced Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans as representing, quote, an extremism that threatens the very foundation of our republic. They are a threat to this country, he said at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, because, quote, they do not respect the Constitution, do not believe in the rule of law, and do not recognize the will of the people. Biden told the Democratic National Committee that the extreme MAGA philosophy is, quote, almost like semi-fascism. In her 2024 acceptance speech, Harris said her opponent also wanted to be an autocrat and jail his political opponents and so forth. She vowed, and the convention joined in chanting, "We are not going back," meaning we are not going back to having Donald Trump as our president. We are not going back to the days of before equal rights and so forth. Politics is tough, Trump told Biden in their meeting in the Oval Office. And it's in many cases not a very nice world, but it is a very nice world today. He was being gracious. Precisely because it is a tough world, American politicians used to go out of their way to be polite and formally, at least, proper to one another, knowing that on a different occasion they may be expected to denounce one another as fascists, communists, oligarchs, and all sorts of other un-American malefactors. Trump occasionally attacked Biden and Harris in similar terms. But it's unusual to make such denunciations the explicit and overarching theme of a whole presidential campaign. Yet this was Biden's opening and Harris's closing message, and they never strayed far from it. To an unusual degree, each party in 2024 accused the other of being a threat to democracy and the Constitution. They meant something different by that, though. The progressives meant our democracy was being threatened. The Republicans meant something more like the original constitutional bargain was being threatened. Sometimes those things might intersect in one of, like, Kamala Harris's famous Venn diagrams, you know, but many times they would not intersect, or at least not very much, as I've tried to indicate by talking about how gradually American liberalism sort of moved away from the founding towards a very different vision of a constitution in the 20th century. That's why I would say it's not implausible that 2024 may signal a new stage in this debate between the Constitution, the original Constitution, and the living Constitution of American liberalism. In sober moments, one would think that even Biden and Harris may recoil slightly at the exaggeration involved in condemning Trump as a Hitler or as a fascist. Several political cartoonists, in fact, imagined a candid moment in their private White House chat when Biden smiled broadly, leaned over, and still sore from how his party had forced him out of the race, whispered to Trump, "You know, I voted for you too." I'd like to think Biden wanted to say that, even if he didn't. Let me sort of come to a conclusion now. When Barack Obama made famous this distinction between history's right side and wrong side, he implied that the former, the right side, not only deserved to win, but that it would win. It would win because it deserved to win. Otherwise, he might have been accused of mere idealism or wishful thinking. Likewise, in his view, the wrong side of history, say the proponents of human slavery or of Donald Trump, consists of losers who defend injustices that are destined to fall or to expire. The purported link between what ought to happen and what will happen is essential to this kind of historical view. Their confidence in the goodness of the future, their secret or visionary knowledge of what is to come, is the root cause of every progressive elite's sense of superiority to those who do not know the future, namely the common people and the politicians who favored them. When Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt first championed this new kind of progressivism in our politics, they were confident it rested on nothing less than the truth, as discovered by the new science of politics and economics then settling into America's colleges and research universities. Hardly any 21st century progressives retain that confidence or continue to believe in progress as an inherent and inevitable historical future. Even or especially Barack Obama, the most thoughtful of its recent political leaders, who showed how to revive progressivism by regarding history not as an object of human will, then as an object of reason or science. Obama taught progressives they had to will the future, which they longed for, into existence, not only by the usual political means, but also by manipulating narratives about it told to themselves and their followers, even as he had manipulated the story of his own life in his postmodern autobiography, Dreams from My Father. If you've not read it, it's very interesting. I must say, he's candid in saying that not everything in his autobiography is true. He says in the very beginning that he has changed the names of some of the characters, that he has combined some people into one fictional character or identity. In other words, he admits that this is a postmodern exercise in self-creation, essentially. Now, a recent biographer of Obama has sort of gotten famous by writing a long 1,000-page biography that goes through Obama's autobiography and sort of shows every fictionalization that he indulged in. He had a number of white girlfriends, for example, which he doesn't mention in the book. He combines them into one or two characters. And there are other things which are quite revealing, actually, which you can now read about in another biography of him, but you can't read about in Obama's autobiography. This, I think, is the real Obama. This is the most radical Obama. This is the postmodern Obama, who regards the distinction between the right and the wrong side of history as not strictly true, but as a good story that could inspire many heroic progressive thoughts and deeds. It ought to be true, but only our resolve can make it true. But Obama's subtleties are too rarefied for most Democratic politicians. They do sense, however, the crumbling foundations of progressivism and of their own belief in it. And so for several decades now, they have propped up their foundations with a new argument from a different combination of social sciences, especially demography and sociology, telling themselves that liberal progressivism is the way of the future, not because of history with a capital H, but because of what they called the emerging Democratic majority. This is the title of a book by Rui Teixeira and John Judas from 2002, which they've questioned in a recent and much better book called Where Have All the Democrats Gone? From 2023, before the election. They predicted back in 2002 that new groups within the Democratic coalition, especially professionals, young women, single women, and minority voters, would augment or displace the old New Deal coalition and result in a new Democratic majority. This coalition of the ascendant, not their term, but a similar idea, this coalition of the ascendant crashed and burned, however, in the 2024 election. The wokeness that accompanied their ascendancy, or their so-called ascendancy, went down with that ship too. And so we are left in the awkward position, if you're a Democrat or a progressive, of being able to trust neither history nor demography to guarantee victory to the right side, to guarantee victory to the right side of history. And that, I think, at bottom is the cause of the greatest internal crisis and doubt in the Democratic coalition, really in the last 25 years. They don't know why, they don't know how they can win, they don't know why they should win. Those two things go together because of their historicism, or because of their expectation that the right side should win. They think they're the right side, but they're not winning. So something is wrong. And figuring out what that something is going to be an enormous task for the Democratic Party and for progressivism in the 21st century. It's that dilemma of the Democrats and the progressives that I think gives a kind of objective correlative, you might say, or a reason for confidence to the Trump movement and to the Trump party. It is not clear yet that the Trump coalition will be ascendant either, or that it will become the kernel of a new majority party on the Republican side. There is some evidence you could point to, and as I have pointed to, that might give you some confidence. But when you combine that evidence with the disarray philosophically as well as politically on the Democratic side, that makes it not, it seems to me, unreasonable to think that something fundamental is changing in American party politics. And that even though President Trump would be foolish to count on it, there is a good chance that he may be right, that a new realignment is underway, even if it is far from being conclusive. Thank you very much.
Why don't we take just a couple questions? Let me give you a mic.
I was waiting for the shoe to drop, and then finally, in the last paragraph, you brought it up with historicism.
Yes.
I wonder whether you might contextualize the political environment in terms of, say, the old-fashioned collapse of what they called the idea of progress. Mm-hmm. That was already criticized at the beginning of the last century, and whether we might have a word or two about the notion of using the idea of nature instead of history as a compass.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. And look, it seems to me that in the fall of the Soviet Union, which went down more or less without a fight, without a shot being fired, we have a kind of unforgettable example of the effects of an internal crisis of confidence. I mean, the official Marxist grounds of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's authority is also a version of historicism. It's a version of the philosophy of history in which Marxism will inevitably triumph and capitalism will be destroyed and the world will be reorganized in a revolution in which the working class will at last become free and man will become undivided and sovereign in the universe. That vision, which inspired the Soviet Union and helped to conduct it into its role as a world power, as a superpower, collapsed with the weight of time and experience. So, Solzhenitsyn used to say that there are no believing Marxists left in the Soviet Union. They're all in American colleges and universities. And when you subtract Marxism from the Soviet political world, what is left to justify the tyranny, the power, which the elite had to use to stay in office? And the answer was not much was left, and the result was the collapse of that regime. Something similar, I mean, the liberalism, progressivism is not the same as Marxism, although it's sort of in a kinship with Marxism insofar as it relies upon history as a happy ending to history as the justification for its authority here and now. But it's quite possible for Trump, to rather than capitalize on this error, you might say, made by the American left, to imitate that error, to embrace it himself. And so I was quite amazed to see him in his inaugural address, begin by saying, "The golden age begins now." And he went on to say, "The future is ours." You know, I mean, really? I mean, from a certain point of view, he's setting himself up to fail. I mean, the golden age. I mean, you're just saying good times are coming. You're saying the best times are coming. That is a big promise to make. Now, it may be that he didn't mean it seriously, but that's certainly possible. But he said it. And a lot of people will take it seriously, including around him and in his own legislative supporters. So that's risky, it seems to me, for him, because it's not really capitalizing on the problems of liberalism. It may be setting himself up to have a similar set of problems when, as inevitably will happen, the golden age does not come, you know, on command when you want it to come. So, I mean, in defense of what he said, he was trying to draw a distinction between the sort of paralysis of the Biden administration and the mistakes that they made in foreign policy and domestic policy and so forth, and what a properly American self-confidence and set of virtues could have done and will do in his administration. But that is not, the future is yours if you have the virtue to take it, if you have the virtue to capitalize on it, to develop it, but it's not yours if you don't. And that's it seems to me, a cautionary note, at least, that might be sounded appropriately now.
Thank you very much for your talk this evening. My question is about like the very, very beginning of what you spoke about when you spoke about the 3 different waves of progressive liberalism. You mentioned the living constitution, but more specifically the idea that it's changing from rights for individuals to rights to groups. I was wondering if you could speak a little more about that.
Yes, so if you go back to Woodrow Wilson, who is the most, not the only, but I think the most clear and comprehensive, you might say, theorist of this progressive turn in American politics. He certainly believes in modern individual rights. He believes that the citizens of modern republics have individual rights, that part of the purpose of government is the protection of those rights. What he doesn't believe is that they have those rights by nature or inherently, qua human beings. They have those rights by being members of modern societies, of belonging to the group of citizens of modern societies. From his point of view, rights don't come from nature or God or someplace outside of the human will or above the human will. Rights are essentially human creations, social creations. And so the proper business of government is not, respecting our natural rights or our individual rights, our inherent rights as human beings. The business of government is creating rights. And so both the rights of life, liberty, and property, those are not natural rights, those are socially created rights by 18th century and 19th century governments. And in the 20th century, you're going to have to change the nature of the rights that government creates because of the emergence of large-scale corporations, urbanization, immigration, all the new social circumstances of the 20th century. This is what FDR, who was, in Wilson's administration and was a committed Wilson supporter as a youth, as a young man, that's what he's talking about in the Commonwealth Club address and elsewhere in the early New Deal, when he says, we need to update our rights and we need a second Bill of Rights. He never said exactly what happens to the first Bill of Rights when you add the second. Bill of Rights. The implication was it's just an addition. You keep all those first generation or first Bill of Rights, but we have now also health care, Social Security, unemployment insurance, all these new rights, social programs. But of course there was a tension between the two sets of bills of rights. From the point of view of the second kind of social rights, you have a duty to pay high taxes in order for people to enjoy expensive rights like health care and all the benefits that now accrue to people. But under the first Bill of Rights, you also have a right to consent to government, and to your property, and not to be taxed for things that government may want, but you don't approve of. So which is more important, your right not to be taxed without your consent, or your duty to be taxed and pay for the rights of other people? That's, in a way, the fundamental moral dilemma of modern government. Whose rights count? Whose rights count more? And Roosevelt never solved that problem, although he helped to create it. But you could imagine some of his answers, but it has been a problem for liberalism ever since. And it's a problem now because part of the problem in its coalition is that it has promised so much to Hispanics, to women, to black citizens, to Asian citizens, to everyone, that it can't fulfill all the promises. There are now contradictions within the coalition, which means tensions, which means a kind of loss of political momentum and unity. And that too is a kind of underlying philosophical problem, I think, that has not at least yet been adequately articulated, much less sort of solved by Joe Biden or by Kamala Harris or even by Obama, who's, I think, a much deeper thinker than either of them.
We should probably end it there, but let's thank Professor Kesler.
Sorry.